On the evening of January 12, 1865, 20 black ministers sat down in a room in Savannah, Georgia. Across from them sat Union General William Tecumseh Sherman and Secretary of War Edward Stanton. The atmosphere in that room was thick with the reality that the rest of the country was still trying to ignore. The war was ending, slavery as a legal institution was dying, and 4 million people were about to enter a freedom that had no floor, no ceiling, and no foundation whatsoever. Sherman wasn't there to offer platitudes. He was a man of logistics, and he had a massive administrative problem. Following his march to the sea, thousands upon thousands of formerly enslaved black people were following his army. In military dispatches, they were often described as impedimenta, a logistical burden that slowed the march. But the men in that room saw something else. They saw people who had been the economic engine of the South for 2 centuries. They were now standing on the precipice of a second disaster, however. Sherman asked them a direct question. Quote, "What do you want for your people?" Unquote. Garrison Frazier, a 67-year-old black minister who had purchased his own freedom years earlier, spoke for the group. He understood that freedom in a capitalist society is a hollow word if you don't own the means of your own survival. He didn't ask for apologies. He didn't ask for a seat at the table. He simply said, quote, "The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land, and to turn it and till it by our own labor." There was no ambiguity in that answer. Land was not symbolic, it was functional, and without land, freedom becomes dependency. Without ownership, survival is always negotiated by somebody else's authority. 4 days later, Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15. It wasn't a suggestion, but it did reserve a massive strip of coastline, roughly 400,000 acres, stretching from Charleston, South Carolina, down through Georgia to northern Florida, exclusively for settlement by black families. 40 acres for each family. Now let me tell you this, the part that nobody tells you, the part that the textbook skipped, the black people moved immediately. By the summer of 1865, 40,000 free people were living on that land. They had planted corn. They were building homes. They were holding federal titles to the soil that they had bled into as property just months before. They established self-governing communities and courts, proving that black economic independence was a functional reality that required only one thing: for the federal government to keep its word. Y'all want to take a guess as to how that turned out? Because then the paperwork changed. The land didn't wash away in a storm, it was taken back by a pen. This is Committed to Misunderstanding. I'm Chuck Lenahan, clinical mental health therapist, and your guide through the history that they decided you didn't need to know. History is the longest record we have of human behavior, and I'm going to read it correctly because I have the receipts.
Clean the language. They trim the land. But truth don't vanish. It just waits to be free. Read the record slow and plain. Every line tells what they changed. Read the record, don't pretend. History speaks when you let it in. 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 When you let it in.
If you're anything like me, you were probably taught that 40 acres and a mule was a promise that failed. It was too complicated or too early to succeed, or that it never fully materialized. And the narrative suggests that the outcome was a natural occurrence, something that happened to people rather than something that was done to them. And that's a lie. The failure of 40 acres was a deliberate documented reversal of a legal land grant. The land was identified, the orders were written, the people were living their lives on it. And then it was taken back. The federal government chose to prioritize the property rights of former Confederate whites over the human rights and physical survival of the black people that they had just emancipated. This wasn't an organizational glitch. It was an overtly orchestrated financial transaction. This episode proves that the wealth of an entire black population was effectively legislated out of existence before it could even take root. I'm going to track how the executive power was used to ensure that black families started the post-war era with zero assets, while former white Southern agitators, rebels if you want to call them that, were restored to the top of the economic hierarchy. Misunderstanding and being ignorant of the truth are often chosen. But I've got the receipts to show you that the history that you were spoon-fed was whitewashed on purpose. To understand how 400,000 acres just vanished administratively, we have to look at the mechanism of conversion itself. In early 1865, General Sherman was dealing with the massive administrative reality of thousands of formerly enslaved people seeking stability. The ministers that we talked about in Savannah provided a clear truth. Without land, freedom was just another kind of dependency. So Sherman's order converted enslaved labor into landholding citizenship. It designated a specific geography, the Sea Islands and the rice fields along the rivers, as black-owned territory. This wasn't a handout. This was the receipt for generations of unpaid labor. By the summer of 1865, 40,000 black people were self-sufficient, forming governing councils, selling crops, and the procedural anchor for all of this was the Freedmen's Bureau Act of March 1865. In it, Congress explicitly gave the Bureau the power to assign 40-acre plots of abandoned or confiscated land to freedmen. For a brief window, the mechanism of extraction was reversed into a mechanism of restoration. The paper trail was being written in favor of justice, but this required the government to treat the Confederate land as truly forfeited. But then Lincoln died. And when Andrew Johnson took office after Lincoln's assassination, he didn't use a gun to stop the train that was coming. He used the executive pardon. Sound familiar to people? Just wait, it gets better. Between May and September of 1865, Johnson issued thousands of pardons to the Southern planter class. Each pardon came with a rider, the restoration of all property rights. Y'all, does that sound like January 6th to anybody? It created a paper war where a black family's possessory title, where it was canceled by a former slaveholder's presidential pardon. Johnson came in and he wiped away everything that Sherman's field order had done. Can't make this shit up, y'all. Let's start out going to Edisto Island in South Carolina. Timeline here is October 1865. This is where the abstraction of policy met the reality of the human face. General Oliver Otis Howard, the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, was ordered by Johnson to tell the people that they had to give the land back. General Howard arrived at a local church where thousands had established schools, spent months building independent lives and livelihoods, and he told them that the president had pardoned the former owners. He suggested that they sign labor contracts with their former masters. So I don't want you to lose sight of what I just said. Because what I just said was they gave them land, they took away the land, and said, well, you know what? You can just go work for the people who now own the land. And maybe you'll get paid for it. The response was documented. One man stood up and said, you take them back from us to give to the very men who have always been our enemies. Why do you do this? General Howard only had the president's paperwork. A committee of men from Edisto, Henry Bram, Ishmael Moultrie, and Yates Simpson, wrote a petition to the president. They wrote, quote, we are the ones who remained faithful to the government when these men were trying to destroy it. So these three gentlemen got a petition and they said, hey, we're the ones who were loyal to the government. We didn't actually create the Civil War. We didn't fight against the U.S. government. It was them, and now you're just going to give them everything that they lost. As a true politician, Johnson didn't answer the petition. What he did do was in September of 1865, he sent out Circular 15, which is a federal order ordering all of the federal agents to facilitate the return of the land to the now pardoned January 6ers. I'm sorry, to the now pardoned white landholders. Families who had been farming for a year were told to leave. The people who were faithful, they were evicted. The people who were traitors, they were rewarded. And if that doesn't sit right with you, that's perfectly fine. It shouldn't. Because when the land was taken back, freedom wasn't just interrupted. It was redirected into a controlled system that ensured that labor remained tied to the soil without actually granting ownership of it. This is the thing that we call sharecropping. It sounds so nice, doesn't it? Because on paper, it was presented as a partnership between those who had the land, the white traders, and those who had the labor. Same people who had always had the labor, the black folk. In reality, though, the receipts showed that it was basically debt peonage, a clinical administrative method of re-enslavement. To understand the mathematical violence of the system, though, I want you to look at what the settling up process was. Because black families had been stripped of the 40 acres that they were farming. They entered the new era with zero assets. They went from enslaved people to landholders to free people with nothing. They were forced into labor contracts with white landlords, often the same men who had previously claimed to own them. Under these contracts, the landlord, they provided the seed, the tools, and a cabin. But make no mistake, they were not provided for free. They were provided as an advance against a future crop that didn't yet exist. So throughout the year, the family had to eat. And in order to do that, when you haven't sold any crops yet, well, they were forced to buy food and supplies from the landlord's commissary or a local merchant, but on credit. And the landlord set these prices. The landlord set the interest rates, often as high as 60%. What y'all think about going out and buying something on your credit card with a interest rate of 60%? And then not being able to pay it because you haven't actually earned any income yet. And so the 60% is just going to keep on growing and growing. So when the harvest came, the landlord was the one who weighed the cotton. Literally. He was the one who had his finger on the scale. He was the one who determined the market value. He was the one who kept the ledger. Take the case of a family in Alabama documented in the records that would later inform the investigation into slavery by another name. For a full year, every member of the family worked the rows of crops from sunrise to sunset. And when I say every member of the family, little kids too. They produced 20 bales of cotton. At the end of the year, they walked to the big house, expecting to finally see profit from their year of autonomy. I mean, these were freed people, right? They were expecting that things were going to go well for them. Landlord opened the ledger, and first he read off their debts. Keep track at home if you want to. $100 for seed, $200 for a fat back and meal, so basically their food, $75 for a new plow, and $150 in interest. So that math ended up being a closed loop because the total debt from that was $575. But that's okay. They were selling cotton at a time when the majority of the world's cotton was being produced in the South. So they should be okay, right? No, because their families, that family's share of the cotton, $500. After a year of back-breaking labor, the family didn't just walk away with nothing. They walked away owing another $75. And under the contract enforcement and vagrancy laws passed by those same restored Confederate legislatures, it was a crime to leave that land when you owed a debt. So if you tried to walk away to find a better life, the local sheriff, often the landlord's cousin or the landlord himself, would just arrest you. This was the theft in the paperwork that replaced the auction block that we talked about in last episode. This is convict leasing at its infancy. The government didn't need to pass a law reestablishing slavery. They just needed to ensure the black families stayed in the red. And they did. There was no way for them to ever get out of this. Because when the market sets the price, things could be maybe a little bit fair. But when the person who you owe money to, your creditor, sets the price, there's never going to be any need for him to make it so that you can prosper. The only way he makes more money is for you to stay in debt. I got to pull a receipt that survived from a plantation in Georgia recorded by the Freedmen's Bureau agent who is trying to document fraud. He recorded the case of a woman named Sarah. She was the mother of 4 who had been a tenant on a restored plantation. Sarah kept her own tally of the cotton that she picked on a piece of scrap wood. She knew she had picked more than enough to cover food and shoes for her children. But on the day of the settle-up, she watched the landlord pointed to numbers in a book that she wasn't allowed to see. When she told him her wood tally didn't match up with his paper tally, he didn't argue the numbers. He threatened her with the chain gang. He told her that her insolence would cost her an extra $10 fine, which he then added to the ledger right in front of her. Sarah left the office and had to go back to the shack that she lived in, and she had to tell her children that despite a year of freedom, they were still bound to the man who hated them. She stayed because the federal government had taken back her 40 acres and then left her in a room with a white man holding a gun and a ledger. This is what policy looks like when it's aimed at people. Anybody who tries to say that any part of post-Civil War America was fair was lied to, and is lying to people. It wasn't fair. It wasn't just. It was extortionary. It was a system that rewarded the traitors who had sought to overthrow the federal government. And I say it again, y'all, I can't make this shit up. Because if this doesn't sound exactly like what the current administration did with January 6ers, I don't know what does. We're at the point in the podcast where I step out of the archives for a moment and speak directly to you as a clinician. What we're looking at here is a perfect case study in what's called intermittent reinforcement and betrayal trauma. And it's being shown to us on a systemic scale. In trauma therapy, we know that the most damaging form of harm isn't just the initial blow. It's the promise of safety that's offered and then immediately snatched away. Reconstruction offered a vision of safety and self-efficacy. It told 40,000 farmers, you're no longer property, you're property owners. This allowed the entire nervous system of an entire community, an entire race, to begin to downregulate, moving off of their high alert survival mode and into a state of ownership mode. When that was reversed by an executive pen, it performed a sort of psychological amputation of their newly formed identity. And this seemingly small act, and I say small because It was just by stroke of a pen. The seemingly small act then determines trust and mistrust of people, of systems, of government for generations. It still happens now. Y'all, black people couldn't ever catch a break. They were taken out of slavery. They were told that they were going to be free. And then everything that we as a country did to them ended up forming more and more links in a chain that just kept them down, subservient. That's what it was all designed to do. And so when we talk about this runs right up against the concept of moral injury. This wasn't a loss, just a loss of property. It was a violation of the foundational human sense of fairness that we had, but also that they had. The families on Edisto Island had been faithful to the government. In return, the government proved itself to be unfaithful to them. And that kind of betrayal creates a learned helplessness at a community level, at a deep-seated community level. And so you have this understanding, that this deep-seated understanding of that no matter how hard you work, how faithfully you follow the rules, that the rules can be changed at any moment to serve the whim of those in power. I need you to let that land for a second, because we as white people, we as the race of majority, we don't understand this. We go down the road in a car. We do 60 miles an hour in a 45-mile-an-hour zone. Oftentimes, we get pulled over, and the cops do the exact same thing every time. First, they touch the back of your car because they have to, just in case something goes awry, they want to prove that they were there. So they put their fingerprints on your car. Then they come up to you and they say, I don't know why they say this, but they say it anyway. Do you know why I pulled you over? Sometimes they ask for your license or registration first, but they're going to get to, do you know why I pulled you over? If you're anything like me, you're going to say no. Why self-incriminate, right? And then they're going to go back to they're going to say, they're going to tell you the reason why they pulled you over, but then they're going to go back to their cruiser. And they have two choices to make at that point. They're either going to write you a warning or write you a ticket. They're not just, going to forget about it. And then they come back and they have you sign your summons, your citation, whatever, or your warning. And then they tell you to have a good day and, slow down. And then they go away. And this is true for every traffic stop that I've ever had as a white man. This is true of every traffic stop I've ever had. This isn't what happens to black folks. Not even close. Because when we talk about moral injury, first of all, we have to realize that the fear that we momentarily as white people feel when we see the red and blues in our rearview mirrors is different than that's seen by black people and brown people. It's different. And the reason it's different is because the rules can change for them. And sure, the rules can change for us too, but they don't. Not generally. But for them, almost always. You can go and you can read the stories of black people who are literally in their military uniforms, still having guns drawn on them. These are people who are serving their country. in the way that many of us don't even do. They're proudly serving their country. They're pulled over for a minor traffic citation, and guns are pointed at them. Or it's no longer, do you know why I pulled you over? It's demanding something. Because for whatever reason, people with darker skin, melanated people, they pose a threat. Not because the person in the car poses a threat, because guilt by association. And we have decided in this country that black people, brown people, people with melanated skin pose a threat to us and to our law enforcement. And I'll tell you something that's really strange. There is more white on white crime than there is black on black crime. There is more white on black crime than there is black on white crime. The story that we have been told about how, black people are savages or, thugs or, super predators. It's bullshit, y'all. It is bullshit. Do the fucking research. It's bullshit. That's why I do this podcast. Moral injury is a real thing. The same rules don't apply. Because again, like I said, here we have 40,000 black people who are told that they were going to get land. And no matter how hard they worked, and no matter how faithfully they followed the rules got changed on them, and by the stroke of a legislative pen, it was taken away and given to the people who rebelled against our country and the way we do things. Who literally shot their own countrymen because they could not stand to lose the power of slavery. This is the origin of what we often mislabel, but is actually a rational behavioral adaptation. It's called systemic distrust. When the protectors, the federal government, became the ones writing the eviction notice, well, then your orientation to the state changes forever. You learn that paper rights are secondary to power. And it's not paranoia. It's historically informed survival strategy in a world that proved itself to be unfaithful. And I've said it before in this podcast, and I'm sure I'll say it again. You can't hear what you won't correctly diagnose. And the diagnosis here is an intentional act of economic sabotage and a profound psychological betrayal. And we did it again and again and again. Right after the Civil War and Reconstruction, and for every decade since. And so when people say they want reparations, when people say that they still want their 40 acres and a mule, they probably fucking deserve it because we gave it to them to begin with, and we let them have it and let them start living their lives for almost a year. And then we just took it away and gave it back to the same people who tried to usurp the government. Can't make this shit up, y'all. This reversal that happened in 1865 is not just a historical moment. It's the origin point of the modern wealth gap in the United States. Not one of many origins. The origin point. Literal ground zero, y'all. Because wealth in America is not primarily built through income, much as we might like to think it is. It is not. It's built through ownership, and then it's multiplied through inheritance. And the land is a foundation for both. If those 400,000 acres had remained in black hands, the trajectory of American wealth would look different today. Not slightly different. Fundamentally different. Because land, it doesn't just hold value, it produces it and then it transfers it across time. So let me slow this down and let's actually walk through it. I want you to imagine a single family in 1865 placed on 40 acres along the Sea Islands. They plant crops. They build a house in that first year. Maybe the yield is modest. Maybe the structures are basic. But the land is theirs. The house is theirs. That means the next year looks different. And then the year after that looks different again. And by the time you reach a decade, that land is no longer just a place to survive. It is an actual asset. And assets change everything. Because once you have land, you have something you can borrow against. You have collateral. That means when your child needs education, you don't have to rely on charity. When a business opportunity presents itself, you're not starting from zero. When illness hits, and it always does, especially in the 1860s, you're not forced into debt that follows you for the rest of your life. Ownership stabilizes risk. And now I want you to extend that forward. So 20 years becomes 40, 40 becomes 80, 80 becomes 160. And this is how generational wealth works. It compounds quietly, consistently. It doesn't require perfection. It requires continuity. A single piece of land held from 1865 to today would not just be worth something. It would be worth millions in many of those coastal regions. But land values it's only the surface. The real value is what that land allows you to do across generations. Like I said, it funds education. It seeds businesses. It absorbs crises. It creates options. And this is what was taken. Not just acreage. Trajectory. Because when that land was removed, the starting point was not delayed. It was reset to zero. And you can't overstate what that means. When you remove the foundation at the beginning of a system that compounds over time, you're not creating a temporary setback. You're creating a permanent gap. Because the people who kept their land, they didn't pause. They continued to accumulate. And so now you have two trajectories moving at the same time. One group begins with land, keeps it, builds it, passes it down. Another group begins with land, loses it, and then is forced into systems designed to extract labor without ever producing ownership. Those trajectories don't converge later. They diverge permanently. And that divergence is what we now call the wealth gap. Today, the median white family in the United States has roughly 8 times the wealth of the median black family. I'll say that again for the folks in the back. The average white family in the United States today is worth roughly 8 times what the average black family in the United States is worth today. 8 times. And that number gets discussed like it's a cultural phenomenon, like it's the result of very different behaviors, different values, different decisions. No, the fuck it's not. No, it's not. It's the result of a policy decision made in 1865 and then reinforced repeatedly afterwards, because the wealth did not disappear. It was removed. The land that was taken from black families was returned to former Confederate agitators. Sorry, I forgot. White Confederate agitators. Those families and their descendants retained that asset. They borrowed against it. They sold portions of it. They developed it. They passed it down. And so when we talk about generational wealth today, we are not talking about something abstract. We're talking about a direct line of continuity that can be traced back to a single administrative reversal. The wealth gap is not a mystery. It's a receipt. And once you see it that way, I hope that a lot of modern conversations start to sound different to you. Let's take the big one. Right off the bat, let's take the big one. The debate around reparations. One of the most common responses is that it's too complicated. We can't give black people reparations because it's too complicated. Where would we get the money? Those were my ancestors. I didn't take their land. Fucking, whatever else the hell they say later. I wish I was just a placeholder, but couldn't think of anything to say. It's infuriating, y'all. The logistics are unclear. Too much time has passed. There's no way to accurately account for what was lost. But you know what? In 1865, it wasn't fucking complicated. The land was already mapped out. The orders were written. The families were placed on it. And then the same government decided to reverse it. It wasn't an invisible loss. It was documented. It was processed. It moved through official channels. The only thing that's complicated now is the willingness to acknowledge that the loss was created through legitimate government action. Because once you acknowledge that, the conversation changes. It's no longer about vague historical harm. It becomes about a specific transfer of assets. And that is a different conversation. We see the echo of 1865 in the way people talk about starting from nothing. Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Fuck that. Phrase gets used a lot. It's used to describe resilience, determination, success against the odds. But starting from nothing is not neutral. Starting from nothing when someone else is starting from something is a structural disadvantage. And in this case, it wasn't an accident. It was designed. Because after the land was taken, what replaced it was not open opportunity. It was systems like sharecropping, debt peonage, and redlining. Systems that ensured that labor continued to produce value, but value did not accumulate in the hands of the people producing it. Again, we talked about criminal leasing, convict leasing. So when people say, why didn't they just build wealth anyway? The answer is embedded in the structure itself. You can't build generational wealth in a system designed to extract it before it even accumulates. And that design didn't end in 1865. It evolved. The spine stayed the same. Which means when you look at the present, the neighborhoods that are under-resourced, the schools that are underfunded, communities that are described as high risk, you're not looking at random outcomes. You're looking at a long shadow of a decision that ensured that one group would begin the post-war era with assets and another group would begin without them, without jack fucking shit. A decision that ensured that that one group could build and the other would have to rebuild from nothing repeatedly. And the baseline has never been corrected, not because it can't be, but because correcting it would require acknowledging how it was created. And that acknowledgement, that disrupts a narrative that has been carefully maintained, carefully constructed, and carefully told. It is the epitome of whitewashed history. Two documents exist from 1865. One designated land for black families, Special Field Order Number 15. The other restored land to former white Confederate agitators. Andrew Johnson's Restoration Orders, Circular Number 15. One created the possibility of independence and the other erased it. This was not confusion. It was not miscommunication. It wasn't a failure of logistics. It was a decision. A conscious decision. And we often look at the world today at segregated neighborhoods, at disparities in health outcomes, at the wealth gap. And we're told these are complex issues with no clear origin. Bullshit. We're told that history is distant. Too much time has passed. But we should move on. Bullshit. But you can't move on from a blueprint where you're still living inside the structure it created, because the effects did not stay in 1865. They carried forward. The betrayal of that year was not a misunderstanding. It was a requirement, a necessary step in restoring the previous social order under a different name. We found a way to legalize slavery. The paperwork ensured that freedom could exist as a language while extraction continued as practice. And it established something even more dangerous. It established precedent. Precedent that black safety, black ownership, black stability could be negotiated away in the name of political reconciliation. That precedent doesn't stay contained. It repeats, it evolves. It shows up in new systems with new language, but the function remains the same. Whitewashed history brought back to its technical reality. This is what it actually looks like. Again, y'all, history is the longest record we have of human behavior. I'm going to keep reading it correctly because I have the receipts. The mechanism changes, the spine does not. And if you don't believe me, we're taking a look at redlining next. How the maps that we still live by were used to ensure, even after rural land was taken, urban wealth was systematically barricaded. How federal policy, again, drew lines, this time in ink and color, so that we could determine who could build the wealth and who could not. When I say that this didn't stay in 1865, it's still happening today. The problem that this podcast seeks to solve is that Black and brown people see it. White people tend not to. Erasure, distraction, enforcement, narrative, responsibility. I'm building the case because I've got 3 seats.
Clean the language. They trim the land. But truth don't vanish. It just waits to be free. Read the record slow and plain. Every line tells what they changed. Read the record, don't pretend. History speaks when you let it in.